That's your final notice. $50,000 for building a fence on my own property. You'll either pay or lose your house.
Interesting.
What's so funny?
You should have checked who owns the water before declaring war.
Power-tripping neighbors love to play God, right up until they realize who controls their heavens. When a tyrannical suburban board demanded $50,000 over a wooden boundary, they forgot one crucial detail. The man they were extorting owned the very water flowing out of their solid gold faucets. Henry Hayes was not a man who sought out conflict. At 38, he lived a quiet, rigorously organized life. He was an engineer by trade and the quiet inheritor of Clear Springs Infrastructure, a localized utility and water management company founded by his grandfather. Henry's wealth was invisible. He drove a 5-year-old Ford truck, wore faded denim, and spent his weekends reading historical biographies. When Henry decided to buy a home in Oak Haven, Colorado, he wasn't looking for status. He just wanted a piece of land with a nice view of the foothills. He purchased a sprawling 4-bedroom property on the absolute edge of the reserve at Oak Haven, a pristine, aggressively manicured subdivision that catered to local executives, retired doctors, and people who cared deeply about the exact shade of their neighbors' mailboxes. Henry chose the lot specifically because it backed up against a dense line of natural pine trees and a small, unpaved utility access road. For the first 6 months, life was peaceful. Henry kept his lawn mowed, paid his exorbitant monthly homeowners association dues on time, and kept to himself. But Henry had a 3-year-old German shepherd named Barnaby, and Barnaby had a habit of wandering toward the utility road whenever a deer passed by. To keep his dog safe, and to block out the occasional headlights from the service trucks that used the back road, Henry decided to build a fence. He didn't cheap out. He hired a top-tier local contractor to install a beautiful, 6-foot-tall, stained cedar privacy fence along the back property line. It was structurally sound, aesthetically pleasing, and practically invisible from the main street of the subdivision. Henry thought nothing of it until the following Tuesday. He returned home from work to find a bright yellow envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a citation from the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Violation of Architectural Guidelines, Section 4, Paragraph B. Opaque fencing exceeding 48 inches in height is strictly prohibited. You have 72 hours to remove the unauthorized structure or face daily fines. At the bottom was a signature in sweeping, aggressive cursive. Brenda Carmichael, HOA President. Brenda Carmichael was an institution in Oak Haven. A 50-something woman who drove a pristine white Range Rover, she treated the subdivision like her own personal sovereign nation. She was notorious for measuring the height of residents' grass with a literal ruler and issuing fines for garbage cans left out an hour past the designated retrieval time. Henry, assuming this was a simple misunderstanding, decided to handle it like a rational adult. He found Brenda the next morning, supervising a landscaping crew near the neighborhood's opulent entrance gates. "Mrs. Carmichael," Henry said politely, extending a hand. "Henry Hayes. I live over on the perimeter lot. I received your notice about the fence." Brenda did not take his hand. She adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked at him as if he were a stain on her freshly paved driveway. "Mr. Hayes." "Yes, the cedar monstrosity. I trust you've scheduled its demolition?" "Well, actually, I wanted to talk to you about that," Henry replied, keeping his tone light. "The fence is on the very back property line. It faces the utility road, not the neighborhood. I have a large dog, and I need the height for security. I reviewed the bylaws before building, and there's a variance clause for perimeter lots facing non-residential zones." Brenda's lips thinned into a hard, bloodless line. "The variance clause is at the discretion of the board, and the board, meaning me, does not grant variances for eyesores that disrupt the open concept harmony of our community. 48 inches, wrought iron or white picket only. You have 2 days left, Mr. Hayes." "With all due respect, Brenda, the fence cost me $8,000 and it's beautifully crafted," Henry said, his patience slightly fraying. "It doesn't disrupt anything. Nobody can even see it unless they're standing in my backyard." "I can see it," Brenda snapped. "And I see a blatant disrespect for the rules that keep this neighborhood exclusive. Remove the fence, Henry, or I promise you, we will make your life here very uncomfortable." She turned her back on him and walked away. Henry stood there, staring after her, a slow, cold realization washing over him. He was not dealing with a neighbor. He was dealing with a tyrant who had never been told no. Henry did not tear down the fence. Instead, he submitted a formal, 30-page variance request, complete with topographical maps, sightline analyses, and local municipal codes regarding security boundaries near utility roads. He sent it to the HOA board via certified mail. He thought logic would prevail. He was profoundly wrong. The fines began exactly 72 hours after the initial notice. The first was a formal letter demanding $250. Henry placed it in a file folder on his desk. The next day, another letter arrived, $500. The fines were compounding daily. Within 2 weeks, the total stood at $4,500. Henry's lawyer, Mitchell Davies, a sharp, no-nonsense litigator who usually handled Henry's corporate utility contracts, reviewed the HOA bylaws. Technically, Henry, they have the power to levy these fines, Mitchell said, leaning back in his leather chair. HOA contracts are notoriously ironclad in this state. You signed the CC&Rs when you bought the house. However, their refusal to even review your variance application is a breach of fiduciary duty. We can fight it, but it's going to be a slog. I'm not backing down, Henry said flatly. It's the principle of the thing. Henry decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting to plead his case to the rest of the board. The meeting was held in the neighborhood's lavish clubhouse, a faux chateau overlooking the community's massive private artificial lakes. The room was packed. Dozens of residents sat in folding chairs, mostly remaining dead silent out of fear of drawing Brenda's gaze. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her loyal lieutenants, Richard Lawson, a retired dentist with a perpetually smug expression, and Cynthia Albright, a woman whose primary hobby seemed to be taking photos of illegally parked cars. When the open forum began, Henry stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Henry Hayes," he began. "I'm here to address the fines levied against my property for a perimeter fence that poses no visual obstruction to the community." Bang! Brenda slammed a wooden gavel onto the table. "Mr. Hayes, you are out of order. Active violators of community guidelines are not permitted to speak during the open forum. I submitted a formal variance request 2 weeks ago," Henry countered, raising his voice to carry over her interruption. "According to Section 9 of the bylaws, the board is required to hold a vote. The board reviewed your application in closed session and rejected it," Richard Lawson chimed in, adjusting his reading glasses. "Your fence is an act of defiance. We don't tolerate defiance in Oakhaven." "It's a piece of wood protecting my dog," Henry fired back, incredulous. "You're fining me thousands of dollars for protecting my property." Brenda leaned into her microphone, her voice dripping with venomous authority. "We own the aesthetic of this neighborhood, Mr. Hayes. You surrendered your right to do whatever you please the day you signed the deed. You will comply. You will tear it down. Or we will take your home." Meeting adjourned. Henry walked out of the clubhouse trembling with a quiet, dangerous anger. He thought he had seen the worst of it. But Brenda was just getting started. 3 days later, Henry was sitting in his home office, reviewing schematics for a municipal water rerouting project, when he heard a tremendous crash from his backyard. Barnaby started barking frantically. Henry sprinted to the back window. A heavy-duty landscaping truck was parked on the utility road. 4 men in high-vis vests were systematically attacking his beautiful cedar fence with sledgehammers and crowbars. Standing on the pavement, sipping an iced coffee and watching with a triumphant smirk, was Brenda Carmichael. Henry burst out the back door. "Hey, stop! What the hell are you doing?" The contractors paused, looking nervously from Henry to Brenda. "Keep working," Brenda instructed the men. She turned to Henry, waving a thick binder in his direction. Section 12, Paragraph C, Mr. Hayes. The HOA reserves the right to forcefully remediate any uncorrected architectural violations at the homeowner's expense. We are removing the eyesore. "You're trespassing and destroying private property," Henry yelled, pulling out his phone. He dialed 911 immediately. 2 police cruisers arrived within 10 minutes. Henry explained the situation, pointing to the shattered remains of his $8,000 fence. The officers walked over to Brenda, who smoothly produced her binder, highlighting the right to remediate clause signed by Henry at closing. The older officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, Mr. Hayes, she's got the signed bylaws here. This is a civil dispute over a contract. I can't arrest these guys for doing a job contracted by the property association. You're going to have to take this to civil court. She's destroying my property, Henry argued. Take it to a judge, buddy, the officer said apologetically. We can't enforce HOA civil contracts. Brenda smiled a cold, terrifyingly smug smile. Have a wonderful day, Henry. Expect the bill for the demolition in the mail. Henry stood in the wreckage of his backyard, gripping his dog's collar as the landscaping crew drove away, leaving behind a jagged, splintered mess of wood. Henry didn't rebuild with wood. The very next week, Henry hired a commercial security contractor. They dug deep trenches. They poured high-grade concrete. They installed an 8-foot-tall commercial-grade steel security fence. It was the kind of fence used to protect military installations. To top it off, Henry installed 4 high-definition security cameras pointing directly at the perimeter. Brenda's response was apocalyptic. 2 days later, a process server knocked on Henry's door, handing him a thick legal packet. Mitchell Davies read it over Henry's shoulder the next morning. They aren't just fining you anymore, Henry, Mitchell said, his voice grim. They've hit you with a $50,000 penalty. They're claiming the steel fence is a commercial hazard. They're billing you for the demolition of the first fence, adding administrative penalty fees, and charging you for their legal costs. $50,000, Henry repeated, his voice dangerously calm. That's not the worst part, Mitchell said, tapping the final page. Because the fines exceed $30,000, the HOA has officially filed a lien against your house. If you don't pay the $50,000 within 30 days, they are going to initiate foreclosure proceedings. They are literally going to steal your house, Henry. Henry sat in silence. He looked out the window of his lawyer's office, watching the city of Oak Haven bustling below, the city that his family had helped build, the city whose underground veins he quite literally owned. A slow, terrifyingly serene smile spread across Henry's face. Mitchell, Henry said softly, pull the master deed for the Oak Haven subdivision, not the HOA bylaws. The original land grant deed from 1998, the one between the developers and my grandfather. Mitchell frowned. Henry, what are you looking for? I'm looking for a way to remind Brenda Carmichael exactly who she's messing with. Mitchell Davies' office was a mess of yellowing blueprints, land surveys, and dense legal contracts dating back to the late 1990s. Henry stood over a massive table, tracing a red laser pointer across a topographical map of the Oak Haven municipality. Here, Henry said, tapping a specific coordinate on the map. This is the entire reserve at Oak Haven subdivision, 300 luxury homes, an 18-hole championship golf course, 3 man-made lakes, heavily stocked with koi and bass, 2 community swimming pools. It's a massive footprint, Mitchell agreed, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. But Henry, I don't see how this stops them from foreclosing on your house. Patience, Mitchell. Look at the water source. Mitchell squinted at the map. They're hooked up to the municipal grid, right? For indoor residential plumbing, yes, Henry explained, his eyes gleaming with a predatory focus. The drinking water, the showers, the indoor taps that all comes from the city grid, which, as you know, is managed by my company, Clear Springs Infrastructure. By law, I cannot interrupt residential drinking water, no matter how much I hate Brenda Carmichael. The state would crucify me. Right. So, where does that leave us? Henry grinned. I can't shut off their drinking water. But a subdivision of that magnitude, with that much pristine landscaping in a drought-prone state, requires millions of gallons of water a month just to keep the grass green and the artificial lakes from drying into mud pits. The municipal grid cannot handle that kind of agricultural load. So, when the developers built the neighborhood in 1998, they had to source an independent water supply for the exterior grounds. Henry pulled out a crumbling, leather-bound folder and gently laid a yellowed document on top of the HOA's foreclosure threat. My grandfather owned the entire 500 acres that Oak Creek Estates now sits on. He sold it to the developers, but he was a shrewd man. He retained the absolute subterranean mineral and water rights. More importantly, he retained ownership of the Cedar Bluff Aquifer, the massive underground reservoir that sits right beneath the neighborhood. Mitchell leaned in, his lawyer brain suddenly clicking into gear. Wait, are you telling me? I'm telling you, Henry said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, concentrated vengeance, that the HOA's sprinkler systems, the country club's golf course irrigation, and the pumps that keep their beautiful, stagnant lakes filled, are entirely reliant on an industrial pump house located on an easement that I own. Mitchell snatched up the 1,998 deed, his eyes flying across the dense legalese. He found the section on the pump house easement. He read it once. He read it twice. A bark of laughter escaped his lips. Henry, this is incredible. The developers negotiated a perpetual, rent-free easement to pump up to 2 million gallons a month from your aquifer for the neighborhood's common areas. Keep reading, Henry urged. Look at the termination conditions. My grandfather didn't like the developers. He didn't trust them. So he added a behavioral contingency. Mitchell dragged his finger down the page, his smile widening into a shark-like grin. Section 8, subsection D. The easement granted herein is contingent upon the maintaining of a good neighbor protocol. Should the grantee, its successors, or assigns, initiate hostile legal action, unprovoked property damage, or financial penalty against the grantor or his heirs, the grantor retains the unilateral right to instantly and permanently revoke this easement without notice or grace period. Mitchell looked up, utterly awestruck. Henry, they destroyed your fence. They fined you $50,000. They put a lien on your house. They haven't just breached the good neighbor protocol. They've nuked it. Exactly, Henry said. Brenda Carmichael thinks she's a queen because she rules the surface. She didn't bother to check who owns the earth beneath her feet. If we revoke the easement, Mitchell started, calculating the catastrophic fallout. If we revoke the easement, Henry finished for him, they lose legal access to the pump house. I shut off the valves. The golf course dies in a week. The grass turns brown in 10 days. Without the circulation pumps, their $3 million artificial lakes will turn into mosquito-infested swamps of dead fish. The property values of the entire subdivision will plummet by 30% overnight. Mitchell actually shivered. It's a nuclear option. She brought a sledgehammer to my backyard, Mitchell. I'm bringing a drought. The preparation took 48 hours. Henry needed to ensure everything was legally airtight. Mitchell drafted the official revocation of the easement, citing the exact HOA violations, the police report from the fence destruction, and the $50,000 lien as the triggers for the Good Neighbor Clause violation. Meanwhile, Henry assembled a crew of 4 of his most trusted, tight-lipped technicians from Clear Springs Infrastructure. On a quiet Thursday morning, while the neighborhood was asleep, Henry led his crew down the utility road behind his house. They walked a quarter mile to a small, concrete bunker hidden behind a grove of oak trees, the main pump station for the HOA's exterior water supply. Because the pump station sat on Henry's easement, he had the master keys. He unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped inside the deafening roar of the massive industrial turbines that were currently pumping thousands of gallons of water into the golf course sprinklers. "All right, boys," Henry shouted over the noise. "Shut it down." The technicians moved with practiced efficiency. They spun the massive iron wheels, closing the main valves. The roar of the turbines whined down into a pathetic shudder, and then silence. "Cap the mains," Henry ordered, "and weld a lockbox over the primary activation switch. I want this place tighter than Fort Knox." Within an hour, the station was dead. Henry stepped outside into the cool morning air. He could already hear the distant, spluttering sound of the country club sprinklers coughing out their last few drops of water before going entirely dry. Henry locked the outer door and secured it with a 3-pound, solid steel padlock. He then taped a laminated copy of Mitchell's legal revocation notice directly to the door. The timing was no accident. Henry knew Brenda's schedule better than she knew it herself at this point. That very weekend was the annual Oak Haven Spring Showcase. It was Brenda's crown jewel, a massive, catered event where the HOA invited local real estate magazines, wealthy prospective buyers, and municipal leaders to tour the lush, blooming gardens and the pristine lakes of Oak Creek Estates. It was her moment to shine, to prove that her iron-fisted rule produced the most beautiful neighborhood in the county. Henry walked back to his fortress of a house, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat by his window. He didn't have to wait long. By Friday afternoon, the temperature spiked to a blistering 92 degrees. By Saturday morning, the day of the spring showcase, the effects were impossible to ignore. Henry watched from his window as a fleet of golf carts, driven by panicked groundskeepers, zoomed back and forth across the neighborhood. The lush emerald green of the golf course was already taking on a sickly, yellowed tinge at the edges. But the real disaster was the lakes. Without the millions of gallons of fresh water circulating through the aquifer pumps, the shallow artificial lakes were heating up rapidly under the harsh sun. The water level was dropping, exposing thick, foul-smelling rings of brown algae along the expensive stone retaining walls. At exactly 10 a.m., Henry's cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed. Oakhaven HOA Board, B. Carmichael. Henry let it ring 3 times. Then, he answered. Henry Hayes, he said cheerfully. Hayes, what have you done? Brenda's voice wasn't just angry. It was shrill, teetering on the edge of absolute panic. The groundskeepers are saying the main pumps are locked out. There's some fake legal notice taped to the door. Turn them back on this instant. We have the mayor arriving in 2 hours. Henry took a slow sip of his coffee. I'm sorry, Brenda, but I can't do that. You see, according to the 1,998 deed of land, your access to that water was contingent upon a good neighbor clause. Fining me $50,000 and putting a lien on my house was a very unneighborly thing to do. You don't own that water, she shrieked. The HOA owns those pumps. You own the plastic pipes, Henry corrected her, his voice dropping its cheerful facade, turning cold and heavy as iron. I own the water. I own the land the pumps sit on, and as of yesterday, your easement is permanently revoked. I will call the police. I will have you arrested for utility tampering. Call them, Henry challenged. I've already forwarded all the deed documents to the precinct captain. It's a civil matter, Brenda, just like my fence. Isn't that what you told me? Take it to a judge? There was a long, breathless silence on the other end of the line. For the first time, Henry could hear the distinct sound of Brenda Carmichael realizing she was not the most powerful person in the room. Henry, please, she said, her voice dropping into a desperate hiss. The showcase, the magazines are here, the lakes are smelling like sulfur. I'll waive the fence fine. I'll take away the lien. Just turn the water back on. Henry looked out at his backyard, at the heavy steel posts that had replaced the beautiful wood she had destroyed. No, Henry said softly, I don't think I will, and he hung up the phone. The Oakhaven Spring Showcase was supposed to be Brenda Carmichael's crowning achievement. Instead, it became a legend of local municipal disaster. By 1 o'clock that Saturday afternoon, the temperature had climbed to 96 degrees. The artificial lakes, deprived of their constant subterranean circulation, began to bake. Algae blooms, usually kept at bay by the rushing aquifer water, exploded across the stagnant surface of Lake Serenity in thick, neon green sheets. Without the aeration pumps, the oxygen levels in the water plummeted, and by 2 o'clock, the expensive, imported koi fish began to float to the surface, their silver and orange bellies shining in the relentless sun. When Mayor Thomas Gable arrived in his Blacktown car, he stepped out, took a deep breath, and immediately gagged. The air smelled strongly of rotting fish and hydrogen sulfide. Chloe Jenkins, the lead photographer for Colorado Estates magazine, abandoned the dying rose bushes and began enthusiastically snapping photographs of a dead koi resting against a scum-covered decorative fountain. Brenda spent the entire afternoon chasing reporters away from the shoreline, her pristine white pantsuit stained with sweat and panic. She desperately tried to spin the disaster as a temporary municipal grid failure, but the damage was irreversible. The mayor left after 20 minutes, citing a sudden migraine. By Wednesday, the manicured utopia of Oakhaven looked like an abandoned wasteland. The championship golf course, planted with water-hungry Kentucky bluegrass, had turned a brittle, sickly brown. Every step on the fairway produced a depressing crunch. The property values of the surrounding homes, inherently tied to the aesthetics of the golf course and lakes, were in freefall. 2 pending home sales, both exceeding $2 million, fell through when the buyers arrived for their final walkthroughs and smelled the putrid swamp that had once been the neighborhood's centerpiece. Brenda, completely out of her depth, dragged Richard Lawson to the downtown offices of Harrison Caldwell, one of the most ruthless and expensive real estate litigators in the state. She slammed Henry's laminated revocation notice onto his mahogany desk. "I want him arrested," Brenda demanded, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "I want an emergency injunction. I want the city to seize his property through eminent domain. He is destroying my neighborhood." Caldwell, a silver-haired man who charged $800 an hour, calmly put on his reading glasses and reviewed the deed, the HOA CC and Rs, and the lien documents. He read in absolute silence for 10 minutes. Then, he took off his glasses and looked at Brenda with an expression of profound pity. "Mrs. Carmichael," Caldwell said smoothly, "you don't have a case." "What do you mean I don't have a case? He's hoarding our water." "He isn't hoarding anything. He owns it," Caldwell corrected. "This 1,998 deed is airtight. His grandfather explicitly leased the aquifer access under a good neighbor provision. By destroying his fence, levying an extortionate $50,000 fine, and attempting to foreclose on his house, you didn't just violate the provision you gave him, a legally indisputable reason to terminate the easement. So we sue him for breach of contract," Richard Lawson sputtered. "You can't sue someone for enforcing a contract you breached," Caldwell replied, leaning forward. "If you take this to a judge, Mr. Hayes's attorney will present the police report detailing your unauthorized demolition of his property. The judge will laugh you out of the courtroom, and you will be ordered to pay his legal fees. An injunction will take months, if not years, to litigate. By then, your lakes will be dirt pits." Brenda's face drained of color. "So, what do we do?" "You surrender," Caldwell said simply. "You grovel. You give this man whatever he wants before the local health department condemns your subdivision for breeding mosquitoes." Brenda refused to grovel. Instead, she tried to double down. She ordered the community landscaping team to hook up hoses to the residential fire hydrants to refill the lakes. Within 3 hours, the city water commissioner, notified by a quiet, anonymous tip from Henry Hayes, arrived with the police, threatening Brenda with federal tampering charges and a $100,000 fine for illegally tapping emergency municipal water supplies. That was the breaking point for the residents of Oak Haven. The neighborhood WhatsApp group, usually reserved for complaining about barking dogs or unkempt mailboxes, turned into a digital war zone. David Higgins, a retired CFO who lived directly on the rotting lakefront, had done his own digging. He pulled the public property records, consulted with his own lawyers, and discovered the truth. Brenda's petty vendetta over a backyard fence had single-handedly destroyed the neighborhood's water supply. On Friday evening, Henry was sitting on his back patio, tossing a tennis ball to Barnaby against his impenetrable steel fence, when his phone buzzed. It was an email from David Higgins, sent to the entire neighborhood directory. Subject: Emergency Recall Meeting, Saturday 9 a.m. Fellow residents, due to the catastrophic mismanagement by our current HOA president, Brenda Carmichael, our property values are collapsing, our amenities are destroyed, and we are facing massive health citations. We have learned this is entirely due to an illegal and unprovoked attack on a resident's property. Tomorrow morning, we are taking our neighborhood back. Attendance is mandatory." Henry smiled, pocketed his phone, and went inside to iron his shirt. The siege was over. It was time for the treaty. The atmosphere inside the Oak Haven clubhouse on Saturday morning was toxic. Over 200 angry, sweating residents were packed into the grand hall. The air conditioning was struggling to keep up with the body heat, and the faint, rotten egg stench of the dying lakes outside seeped through the window frames. Brenda Carmichael sat at the front table, gripping her gavel like a weapon, flanked by Richard Lawson and Cynthia Albright. They looked like a deposed royal family waiting for the guillotine. "This meeting is unauthorized," Brenda shouted into the microphone, trying to be heard over the rumbling crowd. "As president, I have not sanctioned." "Shut up, Brenda," a woman from the back row screamed. "My house smells like a sewer." David Higgins marched down the center aisle, holding a thick stack of papers. According to Section 4 of the state HOA regulations, a petition signed by 60% of the residents mandates an emergency hearing. I have 85% of the signatures right here. He slapped the stack onto Brenda's table. Before Brenda could formulate a response, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. The room fell dead silent. Henry Hayes walked in. He didn't wear a suit. He wore his usual faded denim jeans, a crisp button-down shirt, and heavy leather work boots. Beside him walked Mitchell Davies, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. The crowd parted for Henry like the Red Sea. Nobody said a word as he walked slowly, deliberately, to the front of the room. Brenda stared at him, her eyes wide, her knuckles white around her gavel. "Mr. Hayes," David Higgins said, his tone instantly shifting to one of profound respect. "Thank you for coming." Henry nodded. He didn't look at David. He looked directly at Brenda. "I believe we have some business to conclude," Henry said, his voice calm, carrying effortlessly through the silent room. Brenda swallowed hard. "Henry, the board is willing to negotiate. We will drop the $50,000 fine. We will release the lien on your property. In exchange, you will unlock the pump station immediately." Henry let out a soft, dry chuckle. "Brenda, you seem to be under the impression that we are peers engaged in a negotiation. We are not. You played God with my home. You sent men with sledgehammers to destroy my property. You tried to steal my house. The time for negotiation was 3 weeks ago." Mitchell Davies stepped forward, pulling a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. He handed it to David Higgins, who read it over, his eyebrows rising. "These are my terms for the reinstatement of the aquifer easement," Henry announced to the room. He turned to face the crowd of residents. "Number 1. The immediate and permanent dismissal of all fines, citations, and the lien against my property. Number 2. Full reimbursement for the destroyed cedar fence, totaling $8,000, to be paid from the HOA reserve fund. Number 3. Reimbursement of my legal fees, totaling $15,000. A murmur went through the crowd, but nobody argued. $23,000 was a drop in the bucket compared to the millions in property value they were losing every day. The water stayed off. And finally, Henry said, turning back to Brenda, his eyes locking onto hers. Number 4. Brenda Carmichael, Richard Lawson, and Cynthia Albright will resign from the HOA board, effective immediately. Furthermore, you will all sign a legally binding addendum to the community bylaws banning you from holding any committee or board position in Oakhaven for the rest of your natural lives. Brenda shot to her feet, her chair clattering backward. "You cannot do this. I built this community. I maintain the standards. I am the president." "You're a liability," David Higgins interrupted coldly. He turned to the crowd. "I motion for an immediate recall vote of the current board, to be followed by the immediate acceptance of Mr. Hayes's terms." "Seconded," yelled a man near the window. "All in favor?" Higgins asked. 200 hands shot into the air. It wasn't just a majority, it was unanimous. The residents of Oakhaven looked at Brenda with absolute unfiltered loathing. Brenda looked at the sea of raised hands. Her lip trembled. The power she had wielded for a decade, the petty tyranny she had used to terrorize her neighbors, evaporated in an instant. She looked at Richard, who was staring at the floor, and Cynthia, who had already started packing her purse. "Sign the papers, Brenda," Henry said softly, "or I walk out that door, and your lakes dry up completely by Tuesday." Trembling with a mixture of rage and profound humiliation, Brenda Carmichael picked up a pen. She signed the resignation letter. She signed the lifetime ban. She signed the authorization for the financial reimbursements. When she finished, she dropped the pen, picked up her designer bag, and practically ran down the side aisle, pushing her way out the back doors of the clubhouse without looking back. David Higgins, acting as the interim president, signed the final agreement with Henry. "Mr. Hayes," Higgins said, extending his hand, "on behalf of the sane residents of this neighborhood, I apologize. The check for your damages will be wired to your attorney by Monday." Henry shook his hand. "Appreciate it, David. Have the groundskeepers stand by the sprinkler mains." Henry walked out into the blazing midday sun. He took out his cell phone and dialed his lead technician. "It's Henry," he said. "Cut the locks. Spin the turbines. Give them their water back. 20 minutes later, Henry was sitting on his back patio with Barnaby. From the other side of his towering steel fence, he heard the sudden, glorious sound of high-pressure water rushing through the pipes. The country club sprinklers hissed to life, spraying cool, life-saving arcs of water over the dying greens. Down the hill, the massive outflow pipes began churning millions of gallons of fresh aquifer water back into the stagnant lakes. Henry took a sip of his iced tea, scratched his dog behind the ears, and opened his historical biography to the exact page he had left off on. The HOA never sent him another letter again. 6 months later, Brenda Carmichael sold her pristine house at a loss and moved away, unable to bear the silent judgment of the neighborhood she once ruled. Henry's steel fence remained, a silent, unyielding monument to the day the queen of the suburbs learned that true power doesn't make a sound, it just turns off the tap. When power-hungry people push you into a corner, sometimes the best revenge isn't fighting loud, it's fighting smart. Henry didn't need to scream. He just let the HOA's arrogance dry up their own artificial kingdom. True leverage is knowing what you hold beneath the surface. If you love this story of suburban justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with anyone who's ever dealt with a tyrannical HOA, and subscribe for more incredible true-life dramas.